You know, I'd like to tell you there's a lot of good news out there, or give you some good news about Obamacare, the Patient Protection Affordable Health Care Act. Unfortunately, there isn't any good news. The president told us when this bill was signed into law, the average American would start to save $2,500 a year in health insurance premiums. In reality, premiums went up 13% this year, when health care costs only went up 8%. Now, you may be asking yourself, why was that the case? These greedy insurance companies are just raising rates because they've got an opportunity. There's a little more to it than that. You may know our former governor, Kathleen Sebelius, is now the Director of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C. She has mandated a whole host of new coverages that insurance companies are responsible for putting out there. Let me tell you about a few of them. You used to be able to buy a health insurance policy and decide I want a $1 million policy or a $2 million policy or a $5 million policy. You don't make that decision anymore. The federal government makes that decision for you. Now, all policies are unlimited. Whether you need it or you don't need it, you get to pay for it. So that raised the premiums. Let's talk about some of her most recent mandates that she forced upon the health insurance companies and on you. You now get to pay for the morning after pill. You get to pay for all contraception. You get to pay for breastfeeding classes. You get to pay for domestic abuse classes. All of that is now part of health insurance. I'm not sure what domestic abuse classes have to do with health insurance or breastfeeding classes have to do with health insurance, but you're paying for it. Now, those things may be laudable, and they may all be good things, and you may agree that those are things that you want to see covered by a health insurance policy. You should have the right to buy that, not necessarily have the federal government tell you you're going to buy it. As a 61-year-old male, I probably won't attend a lot of breastfeeding classes. So when you ask yourself what's going on here, what's going on with Obamacare is the federal government is driving itself further and further into your daily life. I don't care if you're 25 or you're 75. This affects everybody in this country, and it's going to affect everybody in this country more and more as we draw toward 2014, when the mandate, if it stands, after the Supreme Court hears the case this year, when the mandate will go into effect that mandates that everyone has to buy health insurance. So let's talk a little bit about how that's going to work. What's going to happen with this mandate if it stands? And I'll talk about the Supreme Court decision here in a few minutes, but let's talk about the mandate. In 2014, if you are a citizen of the United States, you are required to buy health insurance. So the purpose of this is, what really is going on here and what the federal government's trying to do in PPACA or Obamacare, the reason behind this is to take all of those young invincibles, the 25 to 35, 20 to 35-year-olds out there that don't buy health insurance, and force them into a pool to buy health insurance. Because by adding people to that pool, you can then create a subsidy over here for people that supposedly cannot afford health insurance to have health insurance paid for in part by the federal government. So the reason for the mandate is to force as many people into this pool as you can, thereby creating revenue that allows you to move forward with the mandate and allows you to create the exchanges where people have subsidized health insurance. That's what's going on here. So you have to ask yourself a question. If you're 21 years old and you got a brand new F-150 sitting out in the parking lot and the payment is $350 a month, and the federal government says you have to buy a health insurance policy which now costs you $300 a month, are you going to pay that $300 a month, or are you going to pay the $95 penalty? That's probably not a real hard question to answer, is it? You're probably going to go pay your $95 penalty and not pay that $350 a month for a health insurance policy. In 2015, that penalty goes to $325 a year, and in 2016, it goes to $695 a year. I'll go back to my original question. If you're 21 years old, what's more important, the truck payment or the health insurance policy? So whether or not this mandate is going to work remains to be seen, because I think a lot of people are going to opt to pay the penalty and simply not buy the health insurance. Oh, and by the way, here's another point. The insurance companies will not be able to turn you down for pre-existing conditions. So the 21-year-old finds out that he's got a gallbladder problem, he needs a $15,000 surgery, he can go buy a health insurance policy and 2 weeks later go get his surgery done. So you're going to see, as a result of this, what we see in Massachusetts under Romney Care, the Massachusetts Connector, where people game the system. They wait until they're sick, and then they go buy their health insurance policy because the insurance company can't say no. So the question is this going to work? Well, we'll see. I'm not particularly hopeful that it will, and I don't necessarily think that it's going to work the way the federal government says it's going to work. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about businesses. People that are employers, own their own companies, run a business, health insurance. What's going to happen to you? What are you going to be required to do? If you have 50 or more employees, you will then be required to provide health insurance for your employees. Now, the penalties get a little different for folks that are employers. I can't imagine in this business-friendly environment in Washington, D.C. that they would do that, but let's just take a look at what it is they're going to do. There's a thing called the sledgehammer penalty. The sledgehammer penalty will force the employer to pay $2,000 a year in penalties if you don't provide health insurance. And by the way, you don't pick the policy you're going to provide. The federal government will tell you under what policies qualify and what the minimums are that have to be established for your employees. So once again, we're going to see the federal government pushing its way into small businesses and large businesses, forcing employers to buy insurance whether they have it, don't have it, want it, or don't want it, and you will buy a policy that complies with the federal government. All of this is compliments of the folks in Washington, most definitely our Health and Human Services Director, Kathleen Sebelius. There's a mini sledgehammer penalty that's going to be put in place as well. That policy will be somewhat different. That's going to be about a $1,500 penalty on businesses depending on the size and how they fit in this configuration. But either way, the point that's being made here is that you will be required to offer health insurance under the Patient Protection and Affordable Health Care Act. What's going to happen with health insurance premiums between now and 2014? They're going to continue to go up because as you continue to add more and more mandates to these policies, the carriers are going to continue to increase premiums. And if you think, because PPACA, Obamacare, says that the Health and Human Services people have to approve increases, that's not the case. What they do is they can make a ruling on the increases, but they cannot stop the insurance companies from raising the premiums. Only the State Department of Insurance can do that. So the State Department of Insurance can roll back a premium, but not the federal government. You may have recently seen Kathleen Sebelius went after a company called Trustmark, a small group insurance company, and chastised them because their premium increases were higher than 10%. She couldn't force them to roll it back. All she could do was pound the bully pulpit and criticize them for their increases, but she couldn't get it rolled back. So that's a little bit about what we can expect with Obamacare. I'm a broker. I've been an independent broker for 15 years. If anybody would like to talk about their health insurance or your business, I'm right over here next to the lovely ladies with the salsa. If you want to come over and chat with me afterwards, I'll be happy to talk to you. What am I suggesting that you need to do to prepare yourself for this? Find a health insurance policy that you like. Find a carrier you're comfortable with and find a price you're willing to pay. There's a lot of innovation out there right now. There are a lot of carriers offering different kinds of policies. There's a price war going on now between carriers. You've got a price war right here in Kansas between Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Kansas, Preferred Health Systems Coventry. They're going at it pretty hard. The rates in the rural areas under Coventry PHS are significantly lower than Blue Cross of Kansas. Rates in Wichita have held pretty much the same between the two, but rates out here in the rural areas under PHS Coventry are actually lower than Blue Cross now. So there's price competition out there. Aetna, Humana, there are a series of different carriers that are being very competitive. Now is a great time to shop. Tomorrow, when I speak again, I'll talk about small group and individual and how to shop for it and what you can do. Let's switch gears a minute and let's talk about what's going to happen in March when the Supreme Court hears the case on the mandate. You may know Ken Cuccinelli, who is the Attorney General for the state of Florida, brought a lawsuit on behalf of 26 states. He and a gentleman by the name of David Rifkin, who's a constitutional law expert, have filed this lawsuit. The Supreme Court's agreed to hear it. That was a big surprise. That's not a particular surprise the Obama administration was happy with, but it certainly was a big surprise. So there's going to be a hearing now on Obamacare by the Supreme Court. It will either be thrown out or it will be accepted by the court, and it will be the law of the land. It already is the law of the land, but it will be reaffirmed as the law of the land if it's upheld. I would say the tea leaves don't look particularly good for the Obama administration right now. Let me tell you why. There are three things the Supreme Court's going to look at. Number one is the mandate. Can the federal government force you to buy a health insurance policy? Well, we're going to find out. A lot of people think it's unconstitutional. Ken Cuccinelli and David Rifkin wrote in their brief they filed with the Supreme Court that the federal government does not have the power under the Commerce Act, which is the method that they use to put this bill in place, to force you to buy something from a private company. The Commerce Act was never designed to do that. It was designed to regulate commerce between states, but not force individuals to buy something from a private company. This is the first time it's ever been done in the history of this country. So that's going to be heard, and a decision's going to be made. The second part of that hearing that's going to take place is on Medicaid. Under the PPACA, you're going to see about 26 million people dumped into Medicaid that are going to be paid for by you. In the first 3 years, the federal government's going to pay for it. Medicaid is funded by the states. The state of Kansas pays for Medicaid. You may see Governor Brownback being criticized because he's cutting back on some Medicaid benefits. That's because the states pay for it. They have to have the money. Well, the PPACA, Obamacare, greatly expands Medicaid. Tremendous expansion. 26 million people are going to be dumped into Medicaid. You, the taxpayer, at the end of 3 years will get that bill, and there is no way for the states to opt out of this. Once it's in place, they're required to allow people into Medicaid under these greatly expanded benefits. Going to be very different than it is now. So those dollars are going to be the responsibility of the states. That's part of this case. It's going to be heard by the Supreme Court. Can the federal government force the states to do this and then force the states to pay for it? So that's part two. Part three, when the Obama administration and the Justice Departments under Eric Holder realized they had a problem with the Commerce Clause, they decided they were going to change the Obamacare Act from being a Commerce Act issue to being a tax. Because you see, the federal government can tax you for anything, and it's constitutional if it passes. So they changed it to a tax. Well, when the Supreme Court saw this under the area where they've got this plugged into the bill, the Supreme Court decided on its own that they're going to make a decision on whether or not this is a tax. So we'll see what happens. In a federal appeals court ruling in Florida, the judge in that case ruled that they couldn't have it both ways. It can't be a tax and be part of the Commerce Act, so therefore he threw it out. If this happens, if any one of these three legs of this stool falls, if the mandate falls, if the Medicaid portion falls, or if the tax portion falls, Obamacare will be greatly wounded, and it'll be questionable whether it can succeed. Keep one thing in mind. You're probably going to wind up with a Republican House and a Republican Senate. If you wind up with a Republican House and a Republican Senate, Mr. Obama's going to have a very difficult time getting this thing back through, rewritten in a way that it complies with the Supreme Court ruling. So there are some issues there. If the second leg of it fails, if the part that regards Medicaid to the states fails, there's a pretty good chance the whole bill is going to collapse. If the third part of it fails, which is the mandate, you can start the Requiem Mass and put it in a coffin and take it out the door because it's dead. If that happens, if that mandate gets overturned, this thing is finished. Okay? Remember what I said when I first started speaking. The mandate is the funding mechanism that's going to allow Obamacare to put subsidies in place to pay for people that are going to be on health insurance that cannot pay for it. So when you take away the funding mechanism, the whole thing collapses. And then the insurance companies are not going to be in a position where they're going to be able to offer coverage with no pre-existing conditions. Something's going to have to change. It won't work. So that's kind of an overview of where we are. What the Supreme Court's going to do, nobody knows. You've got 4 justices that are liberals and 4 justices that are conservatives. You've got one swing justice, Justice Kennedy. As Justice Kennedy goes, so goes this case. One quick piece of information you might find interesting. There was a recent Supreme Court ruling 9-0 that threw out a redistricting plan in the state of Texas. Now you might wonder, what does that have to do with Obamacare and health care? Here's what it has to do. In the ruling, this was a unanimous ruling, the Supreme Court ruled that the Justice Department had far overreached its authority in delving into state matters and that states' rights must be upheld, and they forced the Justice Department out of that case in Texas and let the redistricting done by the House of Representatives and the Senate in Texas stand. What the interesting nugget that comes out of that applies to Obamacare is the issue here is, does the federal government have the authority to reach into the states and force the states to put these plans in place? That ruling on the redistricting in Texas mimics this issue with Obamacare. So it doesn't look good for the Obama administration if you look at it under that prism. We'll see how it all sorts out. Once again, I don't think anybody knows. None of us know. The insurance companies don't know. The Health and Human Services people don't even know. We can't even get the regulations out of HHS. I'll be in Washington, D.C. next week doing radio, and I'll be interviewing Senator Hatch and Senator Landrieu from Louisiana about some of these issues, as well as other congressmen and senators. And I can tell you right now, it's total chaos. They don't have a clue, because nobody knows how this is all going to sort out at the end of the day. But what I can tell you is this: find a carrier, find a policy, find something you're comfortable with, get it locked in, and stick with it between now and 2014, and we see what's going to happen. Thank you very much for your time. I'll be over here in the booth if you want to talk to me. Thank you again.